Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly disgusting and chemically hazardous world of soap history. The epic journey from Babylonian clay lumps that could strip paint to modern artisanal bars that cost more than your lunch. So before we get our hands dirty with caustic lye and rancid animal fat, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy learning about things that used to regularly maim the people making them. And let me know in the comments what your favourite soap disaster would have been: chemical burns from medieval lye, or just smelling like a decomposing goat for your entire life. Now, dim the lights, maybe light a scented candle, and let's ease into tonight's journey through thousands of years of humans desperately trying not to smell terrible. So, you think you could have survived ancient soap making? Adorable, truly, like a modern person trying to explain to a Babylonian why their clay tablet soap needs 47 different varieties for different skin types. Picture this. You're a Mesopotamian merchant circa 2800 BCE, and you smell like a combination of rancid olive oil, unwashed goat, and questionable life choices. Your clothes stick to you with the dedication of a devoted pet, and your hair has achieved a texture that archaeologists will later describe as structurally significant. You've just closed a deal trading barley for copper, shaking hands with a man whose palm feels like it was marinated in fish sauce and regret. This is your life. This is everyone's life. Welcome to the world before soap, where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, because nobody had figured out how to get clean in the first place. But somewhere in ancient Babylon, some brilliant, nose-wrinkled soul was about to change everything. They looked at their collection of wood ash, animal fat, and clay, and thought, what if I combine these things that individually make me want to die into something that might make me want to live? This wasn't a eureka moment born from scientific method. This was desperation mixed with the kind of experimentation that happens when you're so dirty that even the flies are giving you disappointed looks. The first soap wasn't soap as we know it. It was a clay tablet that someone had mixed with alkali and fat, creating what historians generously call cleansing tablets, but which were essentially prehistoric detergent bricks. These tablets looked like someone had tried to make cookies out of mud and failure, but they worked. Sort of, if your definition of worked included removing one layer of grime while potentially taking off a layer of skin with it. The Babylonians didn't care. They were so thrilled to discover something that could make them smell less like a plague victim that they started mass producing these clay lumps with the enthusiasm of people who had just discovered fire, but for hygiene. The process was about as sophisticated as you'd expect from people who thought the best way to cure a headache was to drill a hole in your skull. They would take wood ash, which contains potassium hydroxide, mix it with animal fat, usually from whatever beast they'd recently convinced to become dinner, and then press this mixture into clay molds. The chemical reaction that occurred was accidental genius. The alkali in the ash combined with the fat to create a primitive form of saponification, the process that turns fats into soap. They didn't understand the chemistry, obviously. They thought it was magic, or the gods rewarding them for finally attempting to smell like something other than a compost heap. But here's the thing about ancient soap manufacturing: it was dangerous in ways that would make modern safety inspectors weep. The alkali was strong enough to burn skin. The animal fat was often rancid, and the whole process took place in poorly ventilated spaces filled with caustic fumes. Workers would emerge from soap-making sessions looking like they'd been wrestling with an angry chemical reaction, which technically they had. Their hands would be raw, their eyes would be streaming, and their lungs would be processing air that was roughly 30% lye vapor. But they persisted, because the alternative was continuing to smell like medieval Europe, and nobody wanted that. The Babylonians weren't the only ones stumbling toward cleanliness through trial and potentially fatal error. The Egyptians, never to be outdone in the ancient innovation department, were developing their own approach to not smelling like a decomposing pharaoh. But Egyptian soap making was different because, well, everything Egyptian was different. They had access to natron, a naturally occurring sodium carbonate that they found in dried lake beds, which was like finding nature's own industrial cleaning supply just lying around in the desert. Egyptian soap was still made with animal fats, But they had options the Babylonians didn't. They could use goose fat, which sounds disgusting, but was actually less offensive than most alternatives. They could use plant oils when they could afford them. And they had perfumes. Egyptian soap wasn't just about removing filth. It was about replacing that filth with something that didn't make people cross the street to avoid you. They added resins, herbs, and oils that transformed their cleansing tablets from barely tolerable necessity to actually kind of pleasant. The manufacturing process in Egypt was still an adventure in occupational hazards, but it was a more organized adventure. They had dedicated soap makers who knew what they were doing, unlike the Babylonian approach of, let's see what happens when we mix this with that, and hope we don't accidentally create Greek fire. Egyptian soap makers were professionals who had learned, through generations of trial and chemical burns, how to create consistent products that wouldn't immediately destroy your skin upon contact. But let's talk about what it was actually like to use these early soaps. First, you needed water, which seems obvious until you realize that most ancient civilizations had a complicated relationship with water that didn't involve drinking or irrigation. Bathing was not a daily occurrence for most people. It was a special event, like a festival or a religious ceremony, except instead of celebrating gods, you were celebrating the possibility of not smelling like a barnyard. Using Babylonian soap was an experience that can best be described as aggressively functional. You would wet your skin, rub the clay tablet against it, and then spend several minutes scrubbing while the soap did its job of removing everything: dirt, oil, dead skin, some living skin, and occasionally your will to continue the bathing process. The soap would create a minimal lather, nothing like the bubbles we associate with cleanliness today. It was more like rubbing yourself with slightly slippery mud that had delusions of grandeur. Egyptian soap was a marginal improvement. It lathered better, smelled better, and was less likely to leave you looking like you'd been attacked by an enthusiastic cheese grater. But better is relative when you're comparing products that were invented by people who thought the sun was a chariot driven by a god with anger management issues. Even the finest Egyptian soap would strip oils from your skin so efficiently that you'd emerge from bathing looking like a very clean piece of leather that had been left in the sun too long. The Greeks, of course, had opinions about everyone else's soap-making efforts. They looked at Babylonian clay tablets and Egyptian bars and said, "This is fine, but what if we made it more complicated and added philosophy?" Greek soap wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about the concept of cleanliness, the ideal of cleanliness, and the societal implications of being clean in a world where most people smelled like they'd been composting. Greek soap making involved olive oil, which was revolutionary because olive oil was actually pleasant and didn't come from the inside of a dead animal. They would mix olive oil with ash from specific plants, creating a product that was gentler on skin and more effective at cleaning. But this wasn't just soap. This was a statement about civilization, culture, and the importance of not smelling like a plague pit. Greek soap was philosophy you could wash with. The manufacturing process in Greece was still hazardous, but it was hazardous with style. Greek soap makers were artisans who took pride in their work, unlike their predecessors who seemed to approach soap making with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for root canal surgery. They experimented with different oils, different ash sources, and different additives, creating varieties of soap that could almost be called luxurious if you squinted and ignored the fact that the best soap available would still be considered industrial solvent by modern standards. But here's what nobody talks about when discussing ancient soap: the economics. Soap was expensive, really expensive. The kind of expensive that made people think twice about whether they really needed to be clean, or if they could just stand downwind from everyone for the rest of their lives. A bar of decent soap could cost more than a week's wages for an average worker, which meant that for most people, soap was a luxury item right up there with having enough food and not dying from preventable diseases. This economic reality created a fascinating social dynamic. Being clean wasn't just about hygiene, it was about status. If you showed up somewhere smelling like roses instead of rotting vegetables, people knew you had money. Soap became a class mark. dividing society between people who could afford to smell pleasant and people who had to hope that everyone else's noses would eventually stop working. The wealthy developed elaborate bathing rituals that involved multiple types of soap, each designed for different purposes. They had rough soap for initial scrubbing, gentle soap for sensitive areas, and perfumed soap for finishing touches. The poor, meanwhile, continued using sand, ash, and prayer, hoping that vigorous scrubbing with abrasive materials would accomplish what they couldn't afford to buy. This brings us to the Romans, who looked at everyone else's approach to cleanliness and said, "Hold our wine and watch this." Romans didn't just adopt soap, they industrialized it, commercialized it, and turned it into a cornerstone of their civilization. Roman soap wasn't just about not smelling bad, it was about Roman superiority, Roman engineering, and Roman determination to be cleaner than everyone else, because being cleaner than everyone else was obviously what made them destined to rule the world. Roman soap manufacturing was the first to resemble anything like a modern industrial process. They had soap factories, which were exactly as pleasant as you'd expect buildings full of boiling fat and caustic chemicals to be. Workers in these factories had life expectancies that would make insurance companies weep. But they produced soap on a scale that made it accessible to more than just the wealthy elite, who could afford to smell like humans instead of barnyard animals. The Romans perfected the use of sodium hydroxide, created from ash, mixed with various fats and oils to create soap that was effective, relatively gentle, and available in different grades for different social classes. Rich Romans got soap made with olive oil and imported fragrances. Middle-class Romans got soap made with local oils and basic scents. Poor Romans got soap made with whatever fat was cheapest that week, and were grateful it didn't immediately burn holes in their skin. But Roman bathing culture was insane, even by Roman standards. Public baths were social centers where people would spend hours soaking, scrubbing, and socializing in water that was shared by hundreds of people daily and changed approximately never. The soap used in these baths had to be strong enough to cut through the accumulated grime of an entire civilization, while being gentle enough that people could use it multiple times a bathing session without emerging looking like victims of a chemical attack. Roman soap came in varieties that would be familiar to us today: hard bars, soft pastes, and liquid formulations for different uses. They had soap for hair, soap for bodies, soap for clothes, and probably soap for their soap, because Romans were thorough to the point of obsession. The manufacturing process involved large vats where fat and alkali were boiled together, while workers stirred the mixture with long paddles, creating clouds of steam that were roughly 50% water vapor and 50% lung, destroying chemical fumes. The workers in these soap factories developed their own culture and traditions, probably because spending your days inhaling caustic vapors while stirring boiling fat creates a bond that's hard to replicate in other professions. They had techniques for testing soap quality that involved rubbing small amounts on their skin and waiting to see if it immediately started dissolving flesh. If it didn't, the soap was considered ready for public use. Roman soap was exported throughout the empire, spreading the technology and techniques to regions that had never considered the possibility that humans could smell like something other than the sum of their organic processes. This was cultural imperialism through hygiene, and it was remarkably effective. Conquered peoples might resist Roman laws, Roman taxes, and Roman gods, but they embraced Roman soap with the enthusiasm of people who had just discovered that life didn't have to be an olfactory nightmare. But the fall of Rome created a soap crisis that would last for centuries. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it took with it the infrastructure, knowledge, and economic systems that had made soap production possible on a large scale. Europe entered what historians generously call the early Middle Ages, but which could more accurately be described as the time when everyone smelled terrible again. Medieval Europeans had to rediscover soap, making from scratch, and they did it with the same competence they brought to medicine, which is to say they tried their best, but often made things worse. Early medieval soap was made using techniques that were part Roman knowledge, part guesswork, and part desperate experimentation by people who were tired of smelling like they lived in a barn, but weren't entirely sure they didn't. The process involved collecting wood ash, leaching it with water to create lye, and then mixing that lye with animal fat in proportions that were determined by trial and error, emphasis on error. Medieval soap makers had a casualty rate that would be concerning in a war zone. The lye was often too strong, causing chemical burns. The fat was frequently rancid, creating soap that smelled worse than the dirt it was supposed to remove. And the final product was unpredictable in ways that kept medieval Europeans guessing about whether their soap would clean them or permanently damage their ability to grow skin. But medieval soap making was also when regional variations began to develop. Different areas had access to different materials and developed their own techniques. Mediterranean regions continued using olive oil when they could get it, creating soap that was relatively gentle. Northern European regions used animal fats exclusively, creating soap that was effective but harsh enough to remove paint along with dirt. These regional differences weren't just about available materials. They reflected different approaches to the fundamental question of whether soap should be gentle enough for daily use or strong enough to remove sin along with grime. The monasteries became centers of soap, making innovation, partly because monks had the time and resources to experiment, and partly because they were motivated by the belief that cleanliness was actually next to godliness. Not just a nice idea when you could afford it. Monastic soap was made with a care and attention to quality that was rare in medieval manufacturing. Monks kept detailed records of their recipes, tested their products extensively, and created soap that was consistently effective without being immediately dangerous to human health. Monastic soap making also introduced the concept of standardized recipes and quality control. Instead of each soap maker inventing their own technique and hoping for the best, monasteries developed procedures that could be followed by anyone with basic literacy and a desire to not accidentally poison themselves with their own products. This was revolutionary in a time when most manufacturing was done by feel, intuition, and prayer. The Crusades, despite being generally terrible for everyone involved, had an unexpected impact on European soap making. Crusaders encountered Middle Eastern soap making techniques that were far more advanced than anything available in Europe. Middle Eastern soap makers had maintained and improved upon Roman techniques during the centuries when Europeans were busy forgetting how to make soap that didn't double as industrial solvent. Syrian soap, made with olive oil and bay oil, was gentler and more pleasant than anything Europeans had seen since the fall of Rome. It lathered properly, smelled good, and didn't require users to choose between being clean and maintaining the structural integrity of their skin. Crusaders brought samples back to Europe, where local soap makers attempted to reverse engineer the recipes with varying degrees of success and chemical burns. This exposure to superior soap technology sparked what could generously be called a soap renaissance in medieval Europe. Soap makers began experimenting with different oils, different ash sources, and different techniques for controlling the saponification process. They still didn't understand the chemistry, but they were developing empirical knowledge about what worked and what resulted in products that could be used as cleaning agents rather than torture devices. The economic importance of soap also began to grow during the medieval period. Soap guilds formed in major cities, regulating production and controlling quality. These guilds were serious about their work because soap that didn't work, or worse, soap that actively harmed users, was bad for everyone's business. Guild soap makers developed apprenticeship systems that ensured knowledge was passed down consistently, rather than being reinvented by each generation with predictably hazardous results. But medieval soap was still a luxury item for most people. A bar of good soap cost more than most people earned in several days of work, which meant that regular bathing with soap remained the privilege of the wealthy and the occasional religious enthusiast who had decided that spiritual purification required physical cleanliness. Most people continued using whatever was available: sand, ash, rough cloth, and optimism. The Renaissance brought a new approach to soap, making that was characteristic of the period's approach to everything. Take the medieval version and make it more complicated, more expensive, and more aesthetically pleasing. Renaissance soap wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about demonstrating sophistication, wealth, and cultural refinement. If you were using plain soap, You were obviously a peasant who didn't understand the finer points of hygiene as art form. Italian soap makers, because Italy was the center of Renaissance everything, developed techniques for creating scented soaps using imported oils and essences. These soaps were works of art that happened to also function as cleaning agents. They were carved, molded, and decorated with the same attention to detail that other artisans brought to sculpture and painting. Using plain soap was like eating bread when you could have a 7-course meal prepared by artists who had opinions about the aesthetic implications of cleanliness. Venetian soap became particularly renowned because Venice was a trade center with access to exotic ingredients from around the world. Venetian soap makers could use oils and fragrances that were unavailable anywhere else in Europe, creating products that were almost magical in their effectiveness and appeal. A bar of Venetian soap was a luxury item that could serve as a gift suitable for nobility, a trade good valuable enough to use as currency, and a status symbol that announced your sophistication to anyone within smelling distance. The manufacturing process in Renaissance Italy was still dangerous, but it was dangerous with style and artistic pretension. Soap makers were considered artisans, not just workers, and they took pride in creating products that were beautiful as well as functional. They developed techniques for marbling soap, creating patterns and designs that made each bar unique. They experimented with colors, creating soaps that were visually appealing as well as effective at removing the accumulated grime of Renaissance living. But Renaissance soap manufacturing also became more scientific, in the sense that soap makers began keeping detailed records of their recipes and results. They still didn't understand the underlying chemistry, but they were developing systematic approaches to creating consistent products. They learned to test their lye for strength, to control temperatures during the saponification process, and to predict how different combinations of ingredients would interact. This wasn't modern chemistry, but it was empirical knowledge that made soap making more reliable and less likely to result in products that could be used as weapons. The Protestant Reformation had an unexpected impact on soap making because Protestant theology emphasized cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual purity. Cleanliness is next to godliness became more than a saying, it became a religious obligation. Protestant regions developed soap, making industries that were motivated not just by profit, but by the belief that providing good soap was a form of ministry. Clean bodies reflected clean souls, and soap makers were doing God's work by making cleanliness accessible to the faithful. This religious motivation led to improvements in soap quality and reductions in price. Protestant soap makers saw their work as serving their communities, not just enriching themselves. They developed more efficient production methods, used local ingredients when possible, and created products that were effective and affordable for working-class families. This wasn't charity, it was theology expressed through industrial chemistry. The Spanish conquistadors encountered soap, making traditions in the Americas that were completely different from European techniques. Native American soap makers used saponins from plants like yucca, creating cleansing agents that were effective and gentle without requiring the dangerous chemistry of fat and lye. These plant-based soaps were a revelation to Europeans, who had always assumed that effective soap required risking chemical burns and lung damage during production. But European colonizers, largely ignored these superior techniques in favor of imposing their own familiar but inferior methods. They established soap-making operations in the New World using European techniques and imported materials, creating products that were less effective and more dangerous than what native populations had been using for centuries. This was colonialism in microcosm, replacing functional local practices with familiar but inferior imported alternatives. The incorporation of New World materials did eventually improve European soap making. Coconut oil, palm oil, and other tropical oils became available to European soap makers, creating possibilities for gentler, more effective products. But this took centuries because European soap makers were conservative by nature and suspicious of innovations that hadn't been tested by generations of careful experimentation and accidental chemical burns. The Industrial Revolution transformed soap, making from a craft practiced by skilled artisans to a manufacturing process that could be scaled up to supply entire populations. This transformation was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it made soap affordable for ordinary people for the first time in human history. Terrifying because early industrial soap manufacturing was incredibly dangerous and often produced soap that was barely safe for human use. Early soap factories were death traps. Workers labored in poorly ventilated buildings filled with caustic fumes, handling materials that could burn skin on contact, operating machinery that could easily remove limbs or lives. The casualty rate in early soap factories was appalling. But the economic incentives were powerful enough that people continued to work in these conditions, because the alternative was often starvation, which was also frequently fatal but less immediately lucrative. But industrial soap manufacturing also enabled innovations that had been impossible for individual artisans. Large-scale production made it economical to experiment with new ingredients, new processes, and new quality control methods. Industrial soap makers could afford to have batches fail because they were producing soap in quantities that absorbed the cost of occasional disasters. This led to rapid improvements in soap quality and consistency. The development of industrial chemistry finally provided soap makers with an understanding of what they were actually doing. The saponification process was explained, the role of different ingredients was understood, and quality could be controlled through scientific measurement rather than experienced guesswork. This was revolutionary for an industry that had been operating on intuition and prayer for thousands of years. French soap makers, because France had opinions about everything including soap, developed the Marseille soap making process, which became the gold standard for quality soap production. Marseille soap was made with olive oil and sea salt using techniques that produced consistent, high-quality results. The process was so successful that Marseille soap became a trademark indicating quality and authenticity, like champagne or Swiss watches. But Marseille soap manufacturing was still dangerous work. The process required heating large quantities of oil and lie to high temperatures, creating conditions that were one mistake away from industrial disaster. Workers developed techniques for managing these hazards, but soap making remained an occupation with higher than average mortality rates well into the modern era. German soap makers took a different approach, focusing on efficiency and standardization rather than luxury and artisanship. German soap was functional, reliable, and affordable, reflecting the German approach to manufacturing everything from soap to philosophy. German soap makers developed industrial processes that could produce large quantities of consistent soap at low cost, making soap accessible to working-class families throughout Central Europe. The German approach to soap manufacturing was methodical and scientific, incorporating new understanding of chemistry as it developed. German soap makers were among the first to use synthetic ingredients, to standardize their processes, and to implement quality control measures that ensured consistent products. This wasn't exciting soap, but it was soap that worked, was affordable, and didn't randomly cause chemical burns. English soap making developed its own character, combining practicality with a peculiarly English approach to luxury that emphasized understatement and reliability over flash and excitement. English soap was good soap that didn't call attention to itself, reflecting English cultural values about the proper relationship between quality and ostentation. English soap makers developed techniques for creating products that were effective, pleasant, and modest in their claims about their own superiority. But English soap manufacturing also became associated with social reform movements that saw clean living as essential to moral improvement. Soap makers like William Lever founded companies that were committed not just to producing soap, but to improving the lives of their workers and customers. These companies built model villages, provided health care and education for their employees, and created products that were designed to improve public health rather than just generate profits. The American soap industry developed differently because America had different raw materials, different social conditions, and different ideas about the relationship between business and society. American soap makers had access to abundant animal fats and plant oils, enabling large-scale production of affordable soap. But American soap manufacturing was also more willing to experiment with new ingredients and new marketing techniques. American soap companies were the first to recognize that soap wasn't just a cleaning product, It was a consumer good that could be branded, marketed, and sold as a lifestyle choice. American soap advertising created the modern concept of personal hygiene as a social obligation, convincing consumers that using the right soap was essential to social acceptance and personal success. But American soap manufacturing maintained the industry's tradition of being dangerous work. Early American soap factories were as hazardous as their European counterparts, with workers facing the same risks of chemical burns, lung damage, and industrial accidents. The difference was that American soap manufacturers were more willing to accept these risks as the cost of doing business in a competitive market. The development of synthetic detergents in the 20th century was supposed to make soap obsolete. Synthetic detergents were more effective, more predictable, and safer to manufacture than traditional soap. They worked in hard water, they didn't leave residue, and they could be produced without the dangerous chemistry of fat saponification. For a while, it looked like traditional soap was going to become a historical curiosity, like candles or horse-drawn carriages. But soap survived the synthetic revolution because people discovered that synthetic detergents, while effective, lacked something that traditional soap provided. Soap felt different on the skin, had a different sensory experience, and carried associations with natural ingredients and traditional methods that synthetic detergents couldn't replicate. Soap became a premium product, positioned as natural, authentic, and gentle in contrast to synthetic alternatives. Modern soap manufacturing combines traditional techniques with modern safety standards and quality control. Soap makers still use the same basic chemistry that Babylonians discovered accidentally, but they do it in facilities with proper ventilation, safety equipment, and quality control systems that ensure consistent results without risking worker safety. This is soap making as it always should have been: effective, safe, and reliable. The craft soap movement of the late 20th and early 21st centuries represents a return to artisanal soap making, but with modern knowledge of chemistry and safety. Craft soap makers create small batches of specialized soaps using traditional techniques, but modern understanding of the science behind saponification. These soaps are often more expensive than industrial soap, but they offer qualities that mass-produced soap can't match: unique scents, specialized ingredients, and the satisfaction of supporting artisanal manufacturing. Craft soap makers face many of the same challenges their predecessors did: controlling the saponification process, ensuring consistent quality, and creating products that are effective without being harmful. But they have advantages that historical soap makers lack: understanding of chemistry, access to pure ingredients, and safety equipment that protects workers from the hazards that made soap making traditionally dangerous. The globalization of soap manufacturing has created a market where consumers can choose between industrial soap made in massive factories, artisanal soap made by individual craftspeople, and everything in between. This variety reflects the history of soap making. Different approaches developed in different places and times, each with their own advantages and limitations. But modern soap manufacturing also faces challenges that historical soap makers never imagined. Environmental regulations control the chemicals that can be used and the waste that can be produced. Consumer awareness of ingredients creates demand for transparency about what goes into soap and how it's made. Competition from synthetic alternatives requires soap manufacturers to justify why traditional soap is worth choosing over more convenient options. The future of soap making likely involves combining the best aspects of traditional techniques with modern understanding of chemistry, safety, and environmental impact. Soap will continue to be made using the same basic process that Babylonians discovered accidentally, but it will be made safer, cleaner, and more sustainably. The chemistry will remain the same, but the context will continue to evolve. And that's the story of soap, from Babylonian clay tablets to modern artisanal bars. From a luxury affordable only by the wealthy to a basic necessity available to everyone. From a dangerous craft practiced by workers with limited life expectancy to a safe industry with proper safety standards. It's a story of human ingenuity, persistence, and the universal desire to smell better than absolutely necessary for survival. The next time you use soap, remember that you're participating in a tradition that spans thousands of years and countless generations of people who are tired of smelling terrible and willing to risk chemical burns to do something about it. That bar of soap in your hand represents thousands of years of experimentation, innovation, and gradual improvement. It's the product of human civilization's long, slow climb from smelling like a barnyard is just how humans smell, to everyone deserves to be clean. From Babylonian merchants mixing ash and fat to modern consumers choosing between dozens of varieties of artisanal soap. The story of soap is really the story of human progress, gradual, sometimes dangerous, occasionally revolutionary, but ultimately successful. We figured out how to be clean, and that changed everything about how we live, work, and interact with each other. And it all started with someone in ancient Babylon who was so tired of smelling terrible that they were willing to experiment with materials that could easily kill them if mixed incorrectly. That's the kind of desperation-driven innovation that built civilization, one small improvement at a time, until we arrived at a world where being clean is so normal that we take it for granted. Which is probably exactly as it should be. The soap industry today faces challenges that would bewilder ancient Babylonians, but would probably seem familiar to medieval guild masters, trying to maintain quality standards while competing with cheaper alternatives. Modern soap manufacturers must navigate environmental regulations that would seem like witchcraft to people who thought the best way to test soap strength was to rub it on their skin and see if it immediately started dissolving flesh. They must respond to consumer demands for natural ingredients, which is amusing given that traditional soap making involved chemicals caustic enough to strip paint, mixed with animal fat that had been rotting just long enough to achieve the perfect level of rancidity. The organic soap movement represents a fascinating return to ingredients that would be recognizable to pre-industrial soap makers, but with safety standards that would seem impossibly luxurious to workers who considered surviving their shift without chemical burns to be a successful day at the office. Organic soap makers use plant-based oils, essential oils for fragrance, and natural colorants, creating products that are both more and less traditional than the soap our ancestors used. More traditional in ingredients, less traditional in the revolutionary concept that soap making shouldn't regularly maim the people making it. Marketing modern soap requires convincing consumers that they need dozens of different types of soap for different purposes, which would confuse ancient peoples who were thrilled to have access to any soap that didn't double as a torture device. We now have soap for sensitive skin, soap for dry skin, soap for oily skin, antibacterial soap, moisturizing soap, exfoliating soap, and soap specifically designed for every part of the human body, as if different areas of our anatomy require completely different approaches to the basic concept of removing dirt. This specialization represents both progress and the kind of commercial excess that would make a medieval monk question whether we've lost sight of soap's fundamental purpose. Medieval monks made one type of soap that was good enough for everyone and everything, from washing bodies to cleaning clothes to probably blessing the occasional religious artifact. Modern consumers can choose between 47 varieties of hand soap alone, each promising to address specific needs that previous generations of humans somehow managed without. The globalization of soap ingredients has created products that would seem magical to historical soap makers. Modern soap can contain oils from around the world, fragrances synthesized in laboratories, and additives that provide specific benefits that ancient soap makers achieved through luck, prayer, and occasionally accidental genius. A single bar of modern soap might contain ingredients from 6 different continents, processed using techniques that incorporate thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about chemistry, manufacturing, and human skin. But this global supply chain also creates vulnerabilities that local soap makers never faced. When a soap manufacturer in medieval Europe ran out of olive oil, they switched to whatever local fat was available and adjusted their recipe accordingly. When a modern soap manufacturer faces supply chain disruptions, they might have to temporarily discontinue entire product lines or find substitute ingredients that maintain the specific properties their customers expect. The environmental impact of modern soap manufacturing is both better and worse than historical soap making. Better because modern facilities have environmental controls, waste treatment, and safety systems that prevent the kind of pollution that was routine in early industrial soap factories. Worse, because modern soap production operates on a scale that ancient soap makers couldn't have imagined, creating environmental impacts that are proportional to the massive quantities of soap needed to supply global markets. Sustainable soap manufacturing has become a major focus for companies that want to maintain the benefits of modern production while reducing environmental impact. This involves everything from using renewable energy in factories to sourcing ingredients from suppliers who practice sustainable agriculture to developing packaging that biodegrades faster than traditional plastic. It's a complex challenge that requires balancing consumer expectations, environmental responsibility, and economic viability. The chemistry of modern soap making is simultaneously more and less complex than historical soap making. More complex because modern soap makers understand exactly what's happening at the molecular level during saponification, can predict and control the properties of their final products, and can test their soap for dozens of different characteristics. Less complex because modern equipment and quality control systems eliminate much of the guesswork and experimentation that made historical soap making an adventure in applied chemistry with potentially explosive results. Modern soap testing involves sophisticated equipment that can measure pH levels, moisture content, hardness, lather quality, and skin compatibility with precision that would seem miraculous to soap makers who tested their products by using them and hoping they didn't cause immediate tissue damage. This scientific approach ensures consistent quality, but removes some of the craft tradition that made soap making as much art as chemistry. The revival of traditional soap making techniques in artisanal soap production represents a conscious choice to return to methods that prioritize individual craftsmanship over industrial efficiency. Artisanal soap makers often use cold, processed techniques that are essentially identical to methods used by medieval guild masters, but with modern understanding of safety and chemistry that makes the process predictable rather than perilous. These craft soap makers face the same fundamental challenges that have always defined soap making. Controlling the saponification process to create products that are cleansing without being harsh, incorporating fragrances and additives without compromising effectiveness, and maintaining consistent quality across different batches. But they also face modern challenges like competing with mass-produced alternatives, meeting regulatory requirements, and convincing consumers that handmade soap is worth the premium price. The cultural significance of soap has evolved from a luxury item that signified wealth and status to a basic necessity that's so common we rarely think about it, and now to a lifestyle choice that can express values about health, environment, and supporting local artisans. This evolution reflects broader changes in how we think about consumption, quality, and the relationship between the things we buy and the lives we want to live. Social media has created new dynamics in soap marketing and consumption that would perplex historical soap makers who were primarily concerned with creating products that worked rather than products that photographed well. Modern soap is often designed to be visually appealing, with colors, patterns, and textures that make it attractive for sharing on social platforms. This represents a return to the Renaissance concept of soap as art object, but with the added complexity of designing products that look good both in person and through digital media. The soap subscription model represents a fundamentally new approach to soap distribution that bypasses traditional retail entirely. Consumers can receive regular shipments of artisanal soaps, industrial soaps, or specialized soaps without ever setting foot in a store. This direct-to-consumer model allows soap manufacturers to build relationships with customers and receive feedback that helps them improve their products, creating a level of interaction between makers and users that hasn't existed since soap was made and sold locally. International differences in soap preferences reflect cultural attitudes about cleanliness, fragrance, and skin care that vary dramatically around the world. Japanese soap tends to be gentle and minimally scented, reflecting cultural preferences for subtle luxury. American soap is often heavily fragranced and designed for convenience, reflecting cultural values about efficiency and sensory experience. European soap varies dramatically between regions, but generally emphasizes traditional ingredients and methods. reflecting cultural appreciation for historical craftsmanship. These cultural differences create challenges for global soap manufacturers, who must create products that appeal to diverse markets with different expectations about what soap should look like, smell like, and feel like. A soap that's perfectly suited for one market might be completely inappropriate for another, requiring manufacturers to develop region-specific formulations that account for local preferences, climate conditions, and cultural norms. The future of soap manufacturing will likely involve increasing customization, allowing consumers to specify exactly what they want in their soap based on their individual skin type, fragrance preferences, and environmental concerns. This mass customization represents a return to the pre-industrial model, where soap was made to order for specific customers, but implemented using modern manufacturing techniques that make customization economically viable. Emerging technologies like 3D printing might eventually allow consumers to manufacture their own soap at home using downloaded recipes and locally sourced ingredients, returning soap production to the household level, but with precision and safety that historical home soap makers couldn't achieve. This would represent a complete reversal of the industrialization that made soap accessible to everyone but removed control over ingredients and quality from individual consumers. The regulatory environment for soap manufacturing continues to evolve as governments balance consumer protection with support for innovation and small business development. Modern soap manufacturers must comply with regulations about labeling, safety testing, environmental impact, and worker protection that would seem impossibly complex to historical soap makers who operated with minimal oversight and maximum risk. These regulations generally make soap safer for consumers and workers, but they also create barriers to entry that can prevent small-scale soap makers from competing with established manufacturers. Finding the right balance between safety and accessibility remains an ongoing challenge for regulators who must protect consumers without stifling innovation or eliminating traditional craft production. The economic impact of the modern soap industry extends far beyond the direct sales of soap products. The industry supports agriculture through demand for plant-based oils, supports chemical manufacturing through demand for processing equipment and additives, and supports retail through distribution networks that bring soap to consumers around the world. This complex economic ecosystem represents thousands of years of accumulated development in manufacturing, distribution, and consumer culture. And so we arrive at the present moment in soap history, where a product that began as desperate experimentation with caustic materials has become a global industry that produces billions of bars of soap annually, while supporting millions of jobs and generating billions of dollars in economic activity. From Babylonian clay tablets to modern artisanal bars, from dangerous craft to regulated industry, from luxury item to basic necessity, soap has traveled a path that reflects the broader story of human civilization itself. The next chapter in soap history is being written now, as manufacturers develop new formulations, new production methods, and new approaches to sustainability and consumer engagement. Whatever that future holds, it will build on the foundation laid by thousands of years of soap makers who are united by the simple goal of helping people smell better than nature intended, and who were willing to risk chemical burns, lung damage, and occasional explosions to achieve that goal. In the end, the story of soap is really the story of human persistence, creativity, and the willingness to experiment with dangerous materials in pursuit of seemingly impossible improvements to daily life. From ancient Babylonians to modern artisans, soap makers have shared the goal of creating products that make life cleaner, more pleasant, and more civilized. And somehow, despite thousands of years of dangerous chemistry, explosive failures, and occasionally lethal working conditions, they succeeded in creating an industry that makes the world a cleaner, more pleasant place for everyone.